This is not a grand tale of war, nor a saga of heroes. It's about a single bolt, one small, insignificant piece of metal that came loose inside the endless machinery of the Imperium, and what followed after it fell. It began during the 7th shift cycle in Manufactorum Theta 9, Hive Cities. The air was thick with incense and engine smoke. Servo skulls floated between assembly lines reciting maintenance hymns. Brother Darnus of the Adeptus Astartes stood motionless under inspection, his armor gleaming with sacred oil and purity seals. Everything was perfect, until it wasn't. A faint clink echoed through the hall. A bolt, small but unmistakable, rolled across the deck. It stopped near the boot of a Mechanicus overseer. Every servo in the room froze. Every worker stopped breathing. In the Imperium, nothing ever just falls. A loose bolt could mean mechanical heresy. It could mean failure. It could mean someone's death. The overseer stared at it, then at Brother Darnus. Which unit lost this holy component? His Vox voice cracked through static. No one answered. The machine spirits, they said, do not forgive negligence. Darnus felt the eyes of 100 adepts burning through him. The air grew heavy, like judgment itself waiting to descend. A single maintenance servitor was dragged forward. It hadn't spoken in decades, its mouth stitched in iron. The overseer demanded penance. The servitor twitched once, then shut down completely. The priests took that as guilt. They purged it on the spot. Later that night, Brother Darnus found the truth. The bolt wasn't from his armor at all. It came from the ceiling, from an old cooling vent ignored for centuries. But the damage was done. The bolt was declared contaminated, its presence recorded as a minor act of sabotage. The Manufactorum held a cleansing ritual that lasted 6 hours. Brother Darnus never spoke of it again, but deep down he understood something vital about the Imperium. In a galaxy built on faith, fear, and machine oil, even a single loose bolt can shake the foundations of devotion. It was the 7th shift cycle in Manufactorum Theta 9, Hive Cities. And, as always, the air tasted like devotion. Every breath carried the sting of incense and engine smoke, that thick, sacred fog of oil and prayer that hung between the rusted beams like mist in a forgotten church. The workers moved like shadows through flickering light, their bodies smeared in dust and sweat. The Manufactorum was a cathedral of steel and fire. Older than the hive itself, it breathed, it groaned, it lived. Pistons thudded like heartbeats, gears screamed, servo arms hissed, and above it all servo skulls floated on humming grav coils, their red eyes glowing as they recited maintenance hymns in broken binary. Their metallic voices blended into the noise, a symphony of hammers, drills, and conveyor belts that never stopped. And yet, inside all that sacred chaos, there was silence. The kind of silence that doesn't mean peace, but pressure. The silence that comes when perfection is expected. When every worker knows that one mistake, one wrong note in the endless hymn, could damn an entire shift. That silence followed Brother Darnus wherever he walked. He wasn't like them. He was in Astartes, one of the Emperor's chosen, sent here by the Ordo Mechanicus for inspection and spiritual maintenance. The workers had never seen a space marine before. They moved slower when he passed. They bowed lower, so low their respirators scraped against their chests. To them, he wasn't a man. He was proof that perfection could exist, a living relic, a machine made holy by faith. Brother Darnus stood in the echoing hall of Station 4779, where the Manufactorum forged bolter shells for the Astra Militarum. Thousands of them, every hour, each one blessed, polished, and prayed over before leaving the line. He stood still, unmoving, a statue of ceramite and flesh. His armor gleamed under the dim light. Gold purity seals fluttered softly in the warm air from the ducts above. The sacred oils on his pauldrons shimmered faintly. Every plate, every servo, every joint had been blessed before the shift began. Perfection, that was the word. And in the Imperium, perfection was worship. Magos Overseer Calvin watched from the gantry high above, flanked by 2 data servitors plugged into the wall by thick, wet cables. His vox mask wheezed like a dying machine. He was more metal than flesh now, and the flesh that remained was mostly symbolic. From up there he could see everything. The lines of workers bending over their stations, the glow of forges painting their faces red, the endless rhythm of movement. Everything in order. He whispered a prayer, the litany of assessment. Blessed be the hand that tightens. Blessed be the mind that obeys. Error is the tongue of heresy. His mechanical limbs twitched as he scanned the air for impurities. None. The machine spirit was pleased. Below, Brother Darnus knelt as 2 lesser adepts inspected his armor. They checked the purity seals, the magnetic locks, the sacred joints, every inch of that holy warplate. He didn't move, didn't speak. His breathing was steady, slow, filtered through the soft hiss of his rebreather. When they finished, both adepts bowed. All components sanctified, Overseer. Calvin nodded. Good. The Emperor watches, and the machine spirit hums in approval. Let the shift proceed. The workers bowed lower. The servo skulls resumed their chanting. The forges roared back to life. Everything continued, flawless, perfect, endless, until something fell. It was almost nothing, a faint metallic clink that got lost in the sea of noise. Almost, but here, in this sacred place, it was deafening. A single bolt, small, ordinary, unremarkable, rolled across the metal floor, spinning lazily before stopping at the boot of a Mechanicus overseer. And just like that, the entire manufactorum stopped breathing. Brother Darnus stood in the echoing hall of Station 4779, where the manufactorum forged bolter shells for the Astra Militarum. Thousands of them every hour, each one blessed, polished, and prayed over before leaving the line. He stood still, unmoving, a statue of ceramite and flesh. His armor gleamed under the dim light. Gold purity seals fluttered softly in the warm air from the ducts above. The sacred oils on his pauldrons shimmered faintly. Every plate, every servo, every joint had been blessed before the shift began. Perfection, that was the word. And in the Imperium, perfection was worship. Magos Overseer Calvin watched from the gantry high above, flanked by 2 data servitors plugged into the wall by thick, wet cables. His vox mask wheezed like a dying machine. He was more metal than flesh now, and the flesh that remained was mostly symbolic. From up there, he could see everything. The lines of workers bending over their stations, the glow of forges painting their faces red, the endless rhythm of movement, everything in order. He whispered a prayer, the litany of assessment. Blessed be the hand that tightens. Blessed be the mind that obeys. Error is the tongue of heresy. His mechanical limbs twitched as he scanned the air for impurities. None. The machine spirit was pleased. Below, Brother Darnus knelt as 2 lesser adepts inspected his armor. They checked the purity seals, the magnetic locks, the sacred joints, every inch of that holy warplate. He didn't move, didn't speak. His breathing was steady, slow, filtered through the soft hiss of his rebreather. When they finished, both adepts bowed. All components sanctified, Overseer. Calvin nodded. Good. The Emperor watches, and the machine spirit hums in approval. Let the shift proceed. The workers bowed lower. The servo skulls resumed their chanting. The forges roared back to life. Everything continued, flawless, perfect, endless, until something fell. It was almost nothing, a faint metallic clink that got lost in the sea of noise. Almost, but here in this sacred place it was deafening. A single bolt, small, ordinary, unremarkable, rolled across the metal floor, spinning lazily before stopping at the boot of a Mechanicus overseer. And just like that, the entire manufactorum stopped breathing. Every servo froze, every worker went still. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Because in the Imperium, things don't just fall. A bolt doesn't simply come loose. A flaw doesn't happen without sin. The overseer bent slowly, robes rustling. His cog-shaped pendant swung as he crouched. He picked up the bolt carefully like it might burn him, a relic of failure touched by blasphemy. Ordinary steel, common shape, used in thousands of machines across the line. And yet, to the Mechanicus, it wasn't a part. It was a prayer, and a prayer had just broken. "Which unit lost this holy component?" the overseer demanded, his vox voice cutting through static. No one spoke. The sound echoed through the massive hall, unanswered. Brother Darnus turned his head slightly. He could feel the weight of their eyes, hundreds of them, workers, adepts. Even the servo skulls stopped their motion midair, their glowing eyes flickering in uncertainty. The air grew heavy. A worker shifted, just a small squeak of a boot. Every head turned toward him. The overseer's mechadendrite snapped like a whip in his direction. "Step forward." The man obeyed, trembling. He was old, hunched, coated in gray dust. His respirator hissed as he stammered, I don't know, my lord, Silence," the overseer hissed. "The machine spirit does not forgive ignorance." He turned to his aides. "Trace the deviation. Check every servo assembly nearby." They hurried off, chanting in Binharik, waving Auspex scanners that beeped and clicked. Brother Darnus said nothing. He watched. His eyes stayed fixed on the bolt in the overseer's hand, the small, dull piece of metal that somehow felt wrong. Not visibly, not mechanically, but spiritually. He could feel it, the same way a soldier feels when the wind changes before battle. He remembered the words of his chaplain long ago. "In the Imperium, brother, faith is the only glue that holds the machine together." The servitors returned. Their eyes blinked green, then red, then green again. "No deviation detected," they droned. "All systems sanctified." The overseer's vox crackled. He sounded frustrated. He looked down at the bolt again. "This thing," he muttered, "should not be." He turned toward Brother Darnus. "Astartes," he said. "Magos," Darnus replied. "Your armor. Check every seal, every screw, every joint. No imperfection can stand before the Emperor's gaze." Darnus nodded. "As you command." He disengaged his left gauntlet. The servo locks hissed open. One by one, he checked each plate, each connection. Everything was perfect. But the silence that followed wasn't reverent anymore. It was fear, heavy, metallic fear, the kind that smells like hot iron and oil. The overseer straightened. The bolt still glinted in his glove. "No flaw in the Astartes armor," he said coldly. "Then the fault lies elsewhere." His vox growled, "Bring forward a maintenance servitor." It took 2 men to drag it in. The thing was ancient, its skin gray, its augmetics corroded, its mouth stitched shut with iron wire. It had no voice, only duty. "This unit was assigned to this section for 27 cycles," the overseer said. "It will answer for the deviation." Darnus frowned. "It cannot answer." The overseer turned sharply. All things answer Astartes. In their way, he extended his mechadendrite and began the rite of inquiry, a long mechanical chant that mixed Binharic code with whispered prayers. The servitor twitched, once, then again. Its head snapped up, fast, unnatural. A faint hiss escaped its throat. Then it stopped, dead still. The overseer froze, his mechadendrite lowered. The servitor's eyes went dark. Its body slumped like a puppet with its strings cut. No one moved. Then the overseer whispered, "Guilty." He nodded to his aides. "Purge it." Flames roared from a cleansing torch. White-hot fire engulfed the body. The air filled with the smell of burnt oil and flesh. Workers bowed their heads, murmuring soft prayers for forgiveness. Brother Darnis closed his eyes. He had seen death before, in war, on battlefields. But this was different. This wasn't about survival. It was about control, a ritual death for the sake of order. When the flames died, only a black husk remained. The overseer turned to the workers. "Let this stand as witness. The machine spirit has been appeased. Resume your duties." And they did. Like nothing had happened. The hammers started. The machines roared. The hymns returned. Everything went back to normal, except the smell. The smell of smoke lingered. That night, Brother Darnis walked alone through the Manufactorum's endless corridors. His armor purred with each step. The lumen strips glowed red and dim, painting the walls like a furnace dream. Purity seals hung everywhere, fluttering in the faint draft, each marked with a name. Of the faithful, or maybe the forgotten. He stopped near a wall vent. The air coming from it carried a strange, rusty scent. He looked up. Something glinted faintly inside the grate. He reached up, pulled the panel open, and there, half buried in dust, lay another bolt. Old, smooth, worn from time and vibration, identical to the one that had fallen. He stared at it for a long time, and he understood. It hadn't come from his armor, or from any sacred machine. It had fallen from the ceiling, from neglect, from time, from age. But in the Imperium, nothing is allowed to just be an accident, so someone had to die. To make order feel unbroken. He slid the grate back into place. He didn't report it. He didn't keep the bolt. He just turned and walked away. His footsteps disappeared into the hum of the machines, into the sound of prayer, into the endless rhythm of a galaxy that can never stop. The next shift didn't start with work. It started with bells. 7 short chimes, one long, the prayer bell, calling for cleansing. When it rang, everything stopped. Every servo arm froze, every machine locked up. Every worker went still like a statue. The huge chronometer above the line flickered strange red digits. That number didn't exist, but here it did. A reminder, Subdeacon Morvis always said, tapping the display with his incense rod, that time bends for duty. The Manufactorum fell silent except for the faint hiss of steam. Then the order came through the Vox speakers. Begin the purification. The cleansing ritual was standard procedure whenever something went wrong, or when someone decided something might have gone wrong. 6 hours of absolute order, 6 hours of fear disguised as worship. Workers lined up in perfect formation. They moved like machines, brushing the decks with solvent mixed with holy oils, whispering the words they'd repeated 1,000 times before. Work is prayer. Error is sin. Servo skulls hovered above them, releasing clouds of incense that burned the nose and blurred the air. The smell was sweet and metallic, like hot copper. The walls dripped with smoke. Brother Darnis didn't kneel. He stood where they'd marked his position, a white chalk circle drawn around his boots. He wasn't a worker, after all. He was a space marine, one of the Emperor's chosen, standing in a place meant for mortals. A thin man in red robes, Subdeacon Morvis, paced up and down the lines, writing notes on a data slate that clicked with every word. He didn't look angry. He looked careful, like a man counting bones. The workers knew the routine. They scrubbed, replaced purity seals, checked connections, then sealed them again with fresh wax. If a worker moved too slow, a servo arm tapped their shoulder. If they moved too fast, another arm hissed and slowed them down. Everything had to be perfect. Silverseer Calvern's voice crackled through the Vox. Inspection, outer systems. Adept teams spread out across the factory floor with scanning wands. They passed the sensors over pipes, gears, vents, anything that could move or burn or break. The wands chirped little green lights when all was well. When one flickered yellow, a priest doubled the incense. When it flickered red, everyone stopped breathing until it turned green again. At one line, a young trainee, barely more than a child, dropped her cleaning brush. It hit the floor with a clatter. The sound was louder than a scream. Morvis turned instantly, eyes like knives. "Repeat your verse," he said. The girl froze. She could barely get the words out. "By conduit and cord, by seal and seam, by gear and—" "Again," Morvis said, with rhythm. She started again, slower this time, her voice shaking. By the end of the chant, she found a steady tone. Morvis nodded and moved on. The execution bell above her station, a huge black shape hanging from the ceiling, stayed silent. The whole line exhaled at once. Over the Vox, Calvern muttered something about alternative service assignments for anyone who failed again. Everyone knew what that meant. Reassignment to the lower sump levels. Few ever came back. Brother Darnus watched her quietly. He didn't say anything, but he knew the truth. Fear was doing the real work here, not faith. 2 hours into the ritual, the next command came. Inspection, inner seals. Panels came off the machines one by one. Adepts opened them like surgeons, exposing thick cables, oil veins, sacred components wrapped in prayer cords. Everything was checked, blessed, and reassembled with reverent hands. The smell of solvent mixed with the scent of sweat. Someone passed around a tray of gray protein paste. The workers ate without looking up, dipping 2 fingers, swallowing, and going back to their prayers. On the chronometer, the time glitched again. Each impossible number was explained away as spiritual marking. A reminder, they said, that faith worked outside logic. Brother Darnus stayed inside his chalk circle, motionless. His armor gleamed in the dim light, wax seals fluttering slightly in the air. Around him, the whole place moved like a living machine, people as parts, chanting like gears turning. He'd seen order before, he'd been ordered before, but this wasn't the kind that inspired, this was the kind that devoured. Halfway through the ritual, the QA priests arrived, the quality assurance order. They looked more like executioners than inspectors. Black hoods under red robes, faces covered by breathing masks. They spoke in flat, mechanical tones as they moved, tapping metal slates covered in raised code. Drones descended from the ceiling, scanning everything in sight. "Randomized sampling," the lead priest said. "No appeals." They opened crates, weighed shells, measured angles that no human eye could detect. They didn't look for problems. They looked for meaning. And when the machines found something acceptable, everyone whispered thanks as if they'd just survived judgment. At one point, a drone paused. Its light flashed amber over one of the lines. 30 workers stopped breathing. It flicked back to green. 30 hearts started beating again. Brother Darnus drifted toward the far side of the chamber. His eyes caught the same ceiling vent he'd noticed the night before, the one with the missing bolt, the same vent that started all this. He could say something. He could point it out. End the mystery, the fear, the waste. But he didn't. Because he knew what would happen. Truth wasn't welcome here. Truth created reports, investigations, more purges. The Imperium didn't want explanations. It wanted order. And order didn't ask questions. Overseer Calvern's voice broke through the noise again. "Knight Darnus," he said. "Your armor's left greave. The seal wax is thinning." Darnus looked down. He hadn't even noticed. A small ribbon of red wax had peeled slightly near his knee plate. A tech adept rushed over, carrying a small tin of wax and a hot seal stamp. He worked in silence, wiping, pressing, and marking the surface again. "Thank you," Darnus said quietly. The adept froze for half a second, startled by the words, then nodded and hurried away. Hours passed. The workers rotated stations. The subdeacon led them in another chant, the hymn of closed loops, a song meant to resync the spirit of the manufactorum. It sounded like 100 tired voices humming in rhythm with gears. Somewhere someone was crying, but it was impossible to tell who. The sound blended perfectly with the machinery's low hum. A cold draft swept through the hall. The vents groaned overhead. Brother Darnus looked up, and for a split second he thought he heard something, a faint tick, maybe metal shifting under strain. He stared at the vent but said nothing. Then Subdeacon Morvis appeared again beside him, holding a small brass box shaped like a cog. "A gift," he said, opening it. Inside was a wax pellet stamped with the symbol of the machine god. "Place this wherever you sense turbulence," Morvis said softly. "It will bring harmony." Darnus took it. It was warm, freshly blessed. He closed his fist around it. "Thank you," he said again. He didn't place it anywhere. Finally, after 6 hours, the overseer's voice came one last time. Record: incident, minor, component, contaminated, cause, unassigned, response, sufficient. That was it. The record would show that the system worked, that faith had corrected the fault. The bells rang again, sharp and cold, and the manufactorum came back to life. Belts started turning, machines started screaming. The endless hum returned. Brother Darnus looked up at the vent one last time. Dust still lined the edges, glowing faintly under the red lights. Somewhere behind it, another old bolt was still sitting there, waiting. He stepped out of his chalk circle. He didn't go to the vent. Instead, he walked to the young trainee from before, the one who dropped her brush. She froze as he approached. "You held your verse," he said quietly. "Keep holding it." He placed the wax pellet on her console. "For turbulence," he added. The girl stared at it, speechless. Darnus turned away and walked back to his station. The machines sang again, the air thick with incense and smoke. The manufactorum was calm once more, but above them the ceiling whispered softly, a sound of old metal shifting under pressure, a single bolt remembering how to fall. This part deepens the story. The aftermath, the reports, and Brother Darnus's unease as the event is buried under ritual and paperwork. The manufactorum went back to normal. At least that's what the record said. The next morning, the bells rang on time. The vents exhaled incense instead of smoke. Servo skulls resumed their rounds, their voices echoing like broken hymns through the ducts. But the quiet felt different. It wasn't peace. It was the silence after confession, the kind that settles when everyone's pretending they've been forgiven. Brother Darnus stood at his post long after the shift began. His armor hummed faintly, reflecting the dull red glow of the lumen strips above. Around him, the workers moved with their usual mechanical rhythm, heads bowed, voices low, hands steady. If you didn't know what had happened the day before, you'd never guess. The burn marks from the purged servitor had already been scrubbed clean. The floor had been repolished, the ashes sealed in glass vials marked evidence of sin, archived. Even the report was done. He'd seen Magos overseer Calvern dictating it earlier that morning, standing before the data shrine, surrounded by servitors clattering their metal fingers against slates. Incident, minor, Calvern said. Cause, component fatigue. Action taken, cleansing ritual, quality review, full resanctification. Recommendation, increase prayer cycles by 3% to ensure spiritual stability. The servitors repeated every word in static monotone, etching the decree into iron tablets. Then, as always, came the closing phrase, the one used for every problem the Imperium didn't understand. Deemed satisfactory in the Emperor's sight. That was it. That was the whole investigation. A bolt fell, a worker died, a ritual was performed, and the system was perfect again. Darnus watched them finish, standing silently in the shadows of the machine hall. He couldn't stop thinking about that sound, the faint clink that started it all. It was still in his head, replaying at random moments. The sound of a small piece of metal falling, and an entire world of faith collapsing around it. He tried to push it away, to bury it under duty, but it stayed. That bolt had done something strange, not just to the machines, but to the people. The fear hadn't left them. It had just been sanctified, turned into another rule, another prayer. Later, during the break cycle, Subdeacon Morvis approached him. He was carrying a data slate in one hand and a sensor in the other, smoke curling around his head like a halo. His face was pale and calm, the kind of calm that comes from believing the worst is over, even when it's not. "Brother Darnus," he said, bowing slightly, "the report has been filed. The Manufactorum has been absolved." Darnus nodded. "Good. Your cooperation will be noted in the record," Morvis added. "The Omnissiah values stillness in the presence of chaos." Stillness. That was their word for silence. "Tell me," Darnus said after a pause, "what happens to the record now?" Morvis blinked, surprised by the question. "It's archived in the Temple of Data, of course, along with all minor infractions and miracles." "Miracles?" "Yes." Morvis smiled faintly. "Every fault corrected is a miracle, brother. Every error found and cleansed proves the Emperor's design. Even this," he gestured vaguely toward the ceiling, toward the vent, toward the truth. That night, the Manufactorum dimmed again into its usual red half-darkness. Most workers slept at their stations, heads resting against consoles, respirators hissing softly. The sound of their breathing blended with the endless hum of machines. Brother Darnus didn't sleep. Astartes rarely did. He walked through the upper gantries, alone, his footsteps echoing over the hollow decks. The smell of metal and oil hung heavy in the air, thicker than incense. He stopped at the cooling vent, the same one, the one with the missing bolt. He reached up and brushed a hand against the grate. It was cold. Dust crumbled beneath his fingers, falling in tiny gray flakes. Something rattled softly inside, a loose screw, maybe, or another bolt waiting for its turn. He stood there for a long moment, staring into the dark. Then he heard it, a whisper. It wasn't a voice exactly, more like air pushing through metal, forming words that shouldn't have been there. It was soft, distant, almost mechanical. He leaned closer. Error. Unreported. The sound faded. He stepped back slowly. He wasn't afraid, exactly. Astartes were trained to face the unthinkable, but there was something about hearing human words come from inside a vent that hadn't been opened in centuries that made his skin tighten beneath the armor. He reported it the next morning, or tried to. Magos Calvern listened, motionless, his vox mask hissing faintly as Darnus spoke. When he was done, the overseer simply nodded once. "The vents speak often," he said. "Air currents. Pressure cycles. The manufactorum breathes, as all holy machines do. It spoke words," Darnus said. Calvern's head tilted slightly. "Machine spirits express themselves in ways mortals misinterpret. Best not to overthink their hymns." He turned back to his servitors, already done with the conversation. "Now, please, return to your post. Faith does not question sound, it amplifies it, and that was it. Dismissed." But Darnus couldn't let it go. The whisper wasn't random. It wasn't wind. He started listening more closely during each shift. Every time the vents cycled, he stood still. Every time the machines quieted, he listened for the pattern. Sometimes he thought he heard words, not full sentences, just fragments, broken phrases like echoes from somewhere else. Not from here. Misaligned faith. Watch the seals. The first few times he tried to tell himself it was imagination, but imagination doesn't leave patterns. And these whispers came in rhythm, timed with the hum of the manufactorum. It was as if the machines were trying to speak through the vent. He started keeping count, quietly, in his own head. Every whisper, every shift, every time the same tone repeated. By the fourth day, he'd heard the word error 7 times. By the 5th, it was 8. By the 6th, the hum itself started to change. Slightly. Not broken, just off. A new frequency. A tone just beneath hearing, low and strange. The same kind of sound, he realized, that had once preceded a single bolt falling. He stood in the silence, surrounded by endless machinery and the smell of oil and prayer smoke. He looked up at the vent again. And this time, he whispered back, "I hear you." The hum deepened, the air shifted, and somewhere in the ceiling something moved. The whisper didn't stop. It kept threading through the vents in broken phrases, just loud enough to feel like a thought that wasn't yours. Darnus started marking the rhythm with his breath. 4 beats hum, 2 beats quiet, like he used to do in siege tunnels when you listened for mines being dug toward you in the dark. Same patience, same pressure. On the 7th day after the fall, the manufactorum's day started wrong. Not the bells. They rang on time, not the incense. It burned hotter than usual, if anything. No, the wrongness came with the boots, Munitorum boots, heavy, polished, walking in formation. They arrived under escort, 6 clerks in dull gray coats, 2 provosts with shock mauls, and a thin woman whose coat bore a row of stamped metal tabs like vertebrae. Her name was stamped on the 2nd, Audit Mistress Vara. She didn't carry incense. She carried a ledger that closed with a lock. The whole floor felt it. You could tell by the way the servo skulls drifted higher, like birds smelling a storm. Magos Overseer Calvern came down from the gantry to meet them. He didn't bow. He inclined by about half a vertebrae. "This manufactorum is sanctified and operational," he said through the vox. "We are within variance and ahead of quota." Audit Mistress Vara clicked her lock open. "You're within your own variance, Magos. I'm here for ours." That was the thing about the Munitorum. They didn't care about hymns, only numbers. And numbers had started disagreeing. Vara held up 3 tablets. "Reports say output from Sector Theta, 9 rose by 3% after your cleansing. Shipments say it fell by 2. Which is it?" Calvern's mechadendrite twitched. "Both can be true depending on the lens." "Not today," Vara nodded to a clerk. "Begin cross-check." Line by line, the clerks fanned out like a small, efficient plague. Quotes. The audit didn't stop production. It braided through it. Clipboards slid between hands, scrubbing seals. Counters clicked beside benedictions. Drones recorded without incense. Provosts stood expressionless where the execution bell's shadow fell. The workers kept their eyes down. Subdeacon Morvis's smile got thinner, something like a crack in wax when it cools too fast. Brother Darnus stayed at station number 4779, watching the braid tighten. He saw where Vara paused the longest, the cooling arrays, the intake ledges, the ceiling vents. Of course. He felt the whisper again, a little stronger today, like the machine had noticed there were new ears on the floor. Error persisted. He looked up. The grate looked back, dust glinting like frost under red light. Night, Morvis murmured at his elbow. A suggestion. Speak little today. Do I often speak much? Darnus said. Less than most, Morvis conceded. More than is safe. By second bell, the Munitorum had built a map. Vara placed it on a portable altar as if to spite the idea it should be holy. Look, she said, your numbers don't flow. Most of the map was lines and boxes. Flow from 77 Alpha to Crateway 6, transfer to Load Bay 3, but the problem sat like a bruise along the top. Loss, cooling and ventilation, not big, not dramatic. A sliver along the edge of every day. Evaporation, Calvern said. Normal. Heat waste. Environmental offerings. Offering to what? Vara said. Your ledger? Morvis stepped in, soft. There are ineffables in sanctified engines, audit mistress. Then make them feffable, Vara snapped. Or don't expect ammunition when your quotas ineffable themselves into shortfall. A provost flicked his shock maul on just once. The crackle hushed things. Vara's tone cooled. We will inspect the vents. That is Mechanicus jurisdiction, Calvern said. The Vox made it a growl. You will not open housings without a right. Then say the right, Vara said. But we are going to look. They stared at each other for 3 long breaths, the priest with a temple for a body, the clerk with a ledger for a heart. Neither blinked. Neither had to. Calvern turned away. Subdeacon, prepare a rite of limited unsealing. Morvis bowed. At once, he moved off, whispering to adepts, collecting tins, stamps, wands. It took 10 people to authorize loosening 8 ancient screws. Brother Darnus felt the floor's attention climb, step by step, toward the ceiling. They chose the grate above 77 Gamma. Not the one Darnus had checked at night, the next in the chain. Maybe that was luck. Maybe that was the manufactorum protecting its own secrets by 1 degree. A scissor lift rose like a slow hymn. 2 adepts rode up with it, palms outstretched, chanting the unsealing. Morvis watched from below, whispering back at their whispers, harmonizing man to machine. Vara watched everything. The adepts pressed hot stamps to the wax seals at the corners, muttered apologies to the bolts, and began to turn them. 3 turns out, 2 turns back, 1 in complaint, then a final, careful release. The grate came away like a lid from an old tomb. Heat breathed down, dry like a kiln's cough. Darnus saw inside. You wouldn't call it a shaft, not really. You'd call it a throat. Dust lined the ribs. Old paint flaked like scabs. Far up, something clicked, then clicked again. An adept reached in with an auspex wand. The light bobbed in the dark. Reading, he murmured. Normal, normal, slight variance, normal. The other adept leaned his head in. Something's a flurry of movement. Not alive, just air and loosened dust. But half the floor flinched. The wand tapped metal. The sound came down clean and cold. The adept drew his arm back and held up the prize. A fastener. Old, smooth at the threads from vibration, sister to the bolt that had fallen. Vara logged it. No expression. How many more? Unknown, the adept said. Estimate. The adept looked at Morvis. Morvis looked at Calvern. Calvern looked at the vent. Enough, Calvern said, to honor the schedule. He meant enough to keep falling for as long as fear needed reasons. Vara nodded once. We'll fit a temporary mesh. Loss through venting will drop. You will not alter the sanctified, Calvern began. Vara set her ledger down and placed one gloved finger on it, as if blessing her own book. Magos. Either I fit a mesh or I mark this line unreliable and divert feedstock. I am here to keep regiments alive. Allow me to keep them supplied. Silence again. You could hear the protein paste tray clink in someone's shaking hands. Calvern's mechadendrite collapsed inch by inch. Mesh. Under right. My adepts will do it. Good, Vara said. We proceed vent by vent. The scissor lift hummed higher. The floor exhaled uneasy, like lungs not used to that kind of breath. Work resumed around the surgery. That was the manufactorum's secret skill. It could bleed in one place and build in another, and call it continuity. Darnis drifted back toward his station. The trainee from 77 Alpha caught his eye. She didn't look like a child anymore. She looked like someone who had learned the weight of her own heartbeat. Is it over? She whispered as he passed. Nothing ends here, he said, not unkindly. It just gets written differently. She nodded, as if that made sense. Above them, another grate came down. Another bolt came out. Another mesh went in. The drone tally clicked in Vara's ledger. Numbers began to make the shape of mercy. For a little while, the whisper in the vents softened. Then, because stories here don't like clean arcs, it changed. Not vents. The hairs along the back of Darnis's neck prickled where the neurosockets met the skin. He stepped away from his chalk circle and stared up at the run of ducts. The voice, no, the pattern, wasn't centered anymore. It was off to the side, deeper in the body of the building. Lower. He followed it the way miners follow a tremor. Down past the main floor, past the sump stairs Morvis had threatened for the trainee, into corridors that smelled like old metal and colder water. No one stopped him. Astartes' armor is a kind of pass. The whisper grew clearer as the noise of the main hall fell away. Not vents, bearings. He found the door by the way it vibrated. A maintenance hatch with half its purity seals worn to smudges. The script along its edge named it Auxiliary Drive. Loop 3, Cooling Intake Conveyance. He palmed the hatch. It didn't move. He looked at the seals, old, not neglected, just tired. Behind him, someone cleared a throat. Audit Mistress Vara stood in the corridor with one provost. No incense here, just the smell of cold and the administrative kind of courage. Night, she said. Curious? Listening, Darnis said. Your mesh won't fix this. Vara didn't smile, but her eyes sharpened. Show me. He stepped aside so she could see the seals. She didn't touch them, but she understood them. Numbers teach you to read without hands. What's behind it? Drive couplings, Darnis said. Bearings running hot. Either misaligned or starved of oil. The vibrations traveling up the shaft. Makes the vents speak, Vara looked at the provost. And why hasn't this been opened? The provost looked at the seals. Because the wax says don't. They stood there a moment between two different empires of should Vara straightened. Fetch the Magos, she told the provost. We'll open it together. It took 20 minutes to collect the proper people and the proper words. Calvern came with 2 adepts, 3 incense tins, and a temper he kept wrapped in ceremony. Morvis came because he was the kind of man who always arrived where rules were about to be bent. The auxiliary loop is stable, Calvern said. We do not meddle where the balance holds. Vara gestured at the hatch. Your balance says loss every day. Morvis raised both hands, palms out. We will not desecrate. We will observe. They performed the short rite. There is no short rite, but they called it short. Wax softened. Stamps hissed. The hatch unclasped with a sigh like a tired man. Heat washed out. Not the dry, old kind, the busy kind, alive. The whisper condensed into sound you could pretend was a voice if you needed it to be. Inside, a narrow gallery, a run of shafts, the thrum of power transmitted, turned, and tamed. And there, half shrouded by age and duty, sat the bearing assembly for Loop 3. Darnus didn't need auspex. He had the kind of senses you grow in armor. He could feel the misalignment in his own knees. 1 degree out of true, he said. Maybe less. Long time, an adept crept forward and touched the housing with a wand. The gauge quivered into yellow. Prayer will not level that, Vara said. Prayer gives you the courage to try, Morvis said. Calvin put a claw to the housing. He was a man of scripture, but he was also a man of steel. You can be both in the Imperium. It breaks you slower. We will need to arrest the loop, he said. 5 minutes. 10. Vara glanced at her ledger, then closed it. Do it. The order ran ahead of them like a wind. Belts slowed. A counter-chorus rose. The litany of pause. A song most workers hate because it reminds them machines can stop, and still the world keeps demanding. The bearing spun down. The hum slid a note lower. For one strange moment, the manufactorum felt like a body holding its breath. Calvern nodded to an adept. Shim. Thin plates, little more than polished slivers, came out of a pouch like knives meant for angels. The adept loosened the housing with hands that had been taught their own alphabet, slipped a shim into the place where precision had grown tired, tightened, loosened, tightened. Another shim. Another breath. Darnus felt the note climb back towards center. It was like a broken bone finding where it used to be. Oil, Calvern said. A cool-smelling fluid dripped into the hungry throat. The bearing drank like it had a memory of thirst. Spin, Calvern said. The loop wound up. Not fast, right? The gauge slid to green and stayed there. The whisper in the vents above the main floor faded, not to silence but to normal. The kind of sound no one hears because it means you can live. Vara exhaled. She didn't look pleased. She looked like someone who had been given back a fraction she could use. Log it, she said. Bearing misalignment corrected. Loss through vibration reduced. Vent mesh retained. She glanced at Darnus. And note the source. Calvern looked at the Astartes as if seeing him for the first time. Not a statue, not a problem. A tool that had just fit a very old task. You listen well, he said. I'm built for it, Darnus said. Morvis closed the hatch with careful hands. The new wax looked too red on the old metal, like a fresh scar on a veteran. Balance restored, he said, almost to himself. Darnus didn't answer. He was listening again. And that's when the whisper returned. Not from the vent, not from the drive, but from somewhere past both. Deeper. Older. Not the last. He felt it in his bones the way he used to feel enemy artillery building on the horizon. This wasn't a single fault. It wasn't even a cluster. It was a pattern, small, survivable failures distributed like prayer beads along a string that circled the entire manufactorum. Vara must have read something in his stance. What is it? Darnus looked down the corridor. The lights didn't flicker. The walls didn't bleed. Nothing dramatic. Just the quiet truth assembling itself. This place isn't breaking, he said. It's remembering how to. Morvis rubbed his thumb across a fleck of dried wax on his palm. An old habit, he said softly, or an old litany. Calvern sealed the final stamp. "Then we will teach it new ones." "Will you?" Vara asked, not unkindly. "Or will you name them different and let the old ones keep singing?" No one answered. They didn't have to. The Manufactorum did the answering for them. The loops spun true, the vents sighed, the bells stayed on time. For today, at least, the numbers and the hymns agreed. They walked back toward the main floor. Work had already forgotten to notice they were gone. As Darnis stepped into the red light and incense again, the trainee at 77 Alpha looked up from her station. She didn't ask this time. She just held his gaze for a second longer than fear allows. He nodded once. "Keep your verse." Then he looked up at the vents, at the gantries, at the chronometer stuck between seconds that don't exist. He knew what Part 5 would be before anyone said it out loud. An audit can count, a write can calm, but only a search can answer the kind of whisper that travels through steel, and the Manufactorum had more throats than anyone wanted to admit. The Manufactorum was quiet, not silent, never that, but quiet in the way a heart is when it learns its own rhythm again. The vents breathed evenly, the bearings turned smooth, the hum had returned to the key the workers called blessed. For the first time in 9 shift cycles, the air didn't taste like fear. And yet, Brother Darnis knew it wasn't over. It's never over in the Imperium. You don't fix the machine, you just convince it to keep turning. Audit Mistress Vara's team had left 2 days ago, their ledgers sealed, their drones packed, their boots echoing down the causeways toward whatever new disaster awaited the next factory. Before leaving, she'd told Darnis quietly, almost as a confession. "The numbers are balanced now. Try not to ask what they cost." He hadn't asked. Magos Calvern stayed behind, of course. He belonged to the place as much as the bolts did. Subdeacon Morvis resumed his rotations, his stylus ticking along the data slates, whispering litanies that filled the empty spaces where fear used to live. Life in Hive Cities went on, shifts, prayers, quotas, sleep. But at night, when the red lights dimmed and the smoke thinned to a whisper, Darnis walked the gantries alone. He listened, not for the voices, but for the absence of them. The vents no longer spoke words. The whisper was gone. What remained was only a soft mechanical sigh, like something very old and very tired, exhaling in relief. He stopped beneath the cooling vent that had started it all. It looked the same as it always had. Grime in the corners, fresh wax around the seals, mesh glittering faintly inside the dark. He reached up, touched the grate, and felt only the steady vibration of order. Still, he could remember it, the single clink, that tiny sound that had birthed all this. One loose bolt, one breath held, one life burned. He'd thought about it more than he wanted to admit. How something so small could carry such weight. How fear in the Imperium didn't come from war or heresy, but from the possibility that perfection might notice you missing a beat. Down below, the trainee at Line 77 Alpha was still there. She had survived every inspection since, reciting her verse with perfect rhythm. He could pick out her voice even amid the drone of the others. A little higher, a little steadier. He had given her the wax pellet that day. She'd set it into her console. It was still there, melted down to a dull red smudge, a mark of turbulence, a mark of faith. Maybe both. The next morning, the overseers called for final reports. Calvern recorded the incident as closed. Morvis filed the new prayers under successful appeasement, and Brother Darnis prepared to return to his chapter's holdship. Before he left, Morvis met him at the docking bay. "You did well here, brother," the subdeacon said. "You heard what others could not." Darnis looked at him. It was just a loose bolt. Morvis smiled faintly. In the Imperium, just is never the right word. He handed Darnus a small metal tag stamped with the Manufactorum's sigil. "For remembrance," he said. Darnus turned it over in his hand. The engraving on the back read, "Work is prayer. Error is sin." He nodded, then sealed it inside his armor's reliquary slot. As he walked to the shuttle, he passed through the Manufactorum one last time. He looked at the rows of workers, the lines of machinery, the glow of forges that never cooled. Every motion was precise, practiced, perfect. But beneath it all, he could feel something else. Not a sound, not a voice, just movement. A pulse under the floor, steady and slow, like the Manufactorum itself was breathing. He realized then that the Imperium wasn't alive because of faith. It was alive because of repetition. The same motions, the same words, the same small acts of fear mistaken for devotion. And maybe that was faith. Maybe there was no difference anymore. He paused at the door, took one last look back. The vent overhead caught the light for just a second. For a moment, he thought he saw something move. A shimmer of dust, maybe, or the faintest shift of air. Then it was still again. He smiled inside his helmet. Not a happy smile, just the kind you make when you understand something you can't change. Outside, hive terrace stretched endless beneath the smog. Thousands of manufactorums, millions of vents, billions of bolts, each one holding the Imperium together, each one ready to fall. He climbed into the shuttle, and as it lifted through the haze, the Manufactorum disappeared beneath the clouds. In his vox, the voice of Magos Calvern whispered a final benediction. "Perfection is not real, brother. Only the fear of losing it." The channel clicked off. Darnus sat in silence, watching the endless red glow of the hive fade into blackness below. He thought of the bolt, the vent, the whisper, and of all the prayers that would be said tomorrow to keep the next one from falling. He closed his eyes. The hum of the shuttle engines filled the air, steady, faithful, mechanical, and somewhere deep within the steel, something small and unseen rattled once, rolled and fell,